Hey everyone, and welcome to an impromptu Digital Foundry Direct. Out of nowhere, Nintendo has announced a new EL model of the Nintendo Switch. Now, everybody out there is probably thinking, hey, this is Switch Pro, it's going to be amazing. I think we should probably temper expectations. And to talk with me about it, John Linneman.
Yes, expectations have been tempered. Yours have been tempered for months now, in fact. So
yes.
You're sitting there with a smug expression like...
I hate to say I told you so.
You told me so. I wasn't sure, but alas, this is an interesting thing. So where do you want to start with this?
Well, essentially, I think we need to stress there is a next generation Switch in development, but this isn't it. It's basically a product refresh, but I think there are several exciting elements to it that make me want to have it. And, a big one is that we've now got a 7-inch OLED screen, replacing the various IPS displays that have been on prior Switches. And that in itself makes it a must-buy for me. And 7-inch screen there versus the 6.2 on the LCDs. It is going to be a very, very slightly larger machine. It's like 0.1 of an inch wider. But fundamentally, the form factor hasn't really changed. They've just made more of the real estate there. And, what more can we add to that? I mean, I guess we can talk more in depth about the various slight changes to the form factor. But I think the thing that we need to stress is that Nintendo has given no indication that the Tegra X1 within the system has been replaced. I suspect that it hasn't. The battery size is exactly the same as the standard Switch. The projected battery life for the unit is exactly the same as the standard Switch. In virtually all respects, it's slightly heavier, but it is basically a Switch with an OLED screen. But there is some interesting minutiae we can discuss, right?
Yeah, that's right. First of all, obviously, the OLED screen, that is the only big upgrade. And I actually think it is a pretty big upgrade, really, because, besides the nature of OLED looking much better than LCD, in my opinion, the original Switch design, they used these panels that were, if you just viewed them in a lit room, the panel itself appeared very gray. You know what I mean? Even when it was not powered on. And this just kind of gave the entire system this lack of contrast when playing in portable mode that I was never too fond of. So just having, a higher quality screen, a nice pure black OLED like this, I think is actually pretty big deal, on top of the fact that the actual design is refined. I like the new look of the unit itself. Even though it's relatively subtle, it's more focused on slightly curved edges, especially in the dock. And I think the dock is actually probably what's changed the most, kind of, even though the changes are pretty weird. Okay, so they call the dock the Nintendo Switch dock with LAN port.
Right.
And then the original is Nintendo Switch dock.
Okay.
And it is 0.1 inches longer, but it's actually 0.12 inches less deep.
Okay.
So it's a slightly different size. It's also weighs less, which is interesting. They've added the LAN port, but in exchange for that, they've removed the internal USB port.
Right.
So that is now gone. Which I kind of see that because, at least in my case, I use the internal USB port as a LAN adapter port already.
I think a lot of people do.
Yeah. So they're just basically swapping that out. And that's completely fine. I think that's not a problem at all. One of the interesting things I think I noticed is if you look inside the dock, you can actually see that there's more venting within the dock now compared to before, which is curious.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, the original dock is just kind of a pretty agricultural bit of plastic and very basic electronics in it. But, the heat dissipation thing was always raised as a bit of an issue with it. It doesn't seem particularly optimal, and they seem to have added extra venting to it.
So one of the things that we have no confirmation on, it's unlikely they would do this, but, we know the Switch, the Tegra chip, has higher clocks available to it.
Right.
We know this because it is possible to enable this in homebrew mode. You can overclock the Switch, and it seems to perform just fine.
Yeah, it does get hotter.
That's the thing. It does get hotter, which in a way means that potentially when it's in the dock, maybe this helps a little bit, but officially I don't expect them to actually change the clocks.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, basically, the Switch originally launched with a standard Tegra X1. I mean, they called it a custom NVIDIA processor, but I didn't actually see at the sort of layout level any differences to a standard X1. But they did lower the clocks. The CPU can hit almost 1.8 gigahertz, but it's limited to 1 gigahertz on the Switch. The GPU clocks are pared back as well, 768 megahertz versus 921. But then Nintendo basically seemed to shift over to what's known as the Mariko chip, which is essentially a 16 nanometer version of the 20 nanometer original. And it's cooler, it's more efficient, but it also offers up extra performance. Now, the CPU still tops out at 1.8 gigahertz or thereabouts, 1.785 if we want to get stupidly specific about it. But the GPU clock here actually is theoretically got a much higher ceiling. That 921 megahertz, the original, shifts to, just looking at my notes here, 1.267 gigahertz. So, you know, in theory, if Nintendo wanted to do it, they could increase the CPU clock, they could increase the GPU clock, they could make the Switch significantly more powerful if they wanted to. There would be a cooling issue, and there would be obviously a battery life issue. Now the question is whether they will actually do it or not.
Two things that could have been solved, by the way, if they had actually re-engineered the unit with this in mind.
Yeah.
And they have re-engineered the unit. And we see things like the extra venting on the dock.
Yeah.
It's unlikely any of this ties into that, but this was their opportunity to do it, right? Like, this was the chance.
Absolutely, and I do think we're being a bit power hungry and clutching at straws here. But
yeah, I know.
It is theoretically possible. So I'm absolutely fascinated to see if anything will come of that. But I think it is basically a bunch of quality of life improvements, and that starts with the OLED screen, which I think is going to be particularly impactful. But, shock horror, they have addressed a fundamental flaw of the original Switch, which is that the kickstand is legendarily awful.
Yeah.
And things seem to have been switched up here.
Yeah, they seem to have taken design cues from the Surface products from Microsoft. Which with that full kickstand that covers the length of the unit essentially. Mm-hmm. So it seems to be adjustable with multiple angles this time, and it looks significantly more sturdy. So, you know, I have used it in this mode before, and that actually is kind of an appealing thing, so I'm happy to see that. So that's one of the physical changes on the unit. Another thing is they've added a light sensor, or a brightness sensor, to the top of the unit, like cell phones often use in various other devices, perhaps in pursuit of improved battery life. They allow it to adjust the brightness to sort of fit the environment it's in. I guess, though, just the lack of updates on this, really, if you look at the history of Nintendo portables, and this is sort of a Nintendo portable, despite its dockable capabilities, I mean, this is right in line with everything you've done before, just a little bit later, right? Yeah. Going back to the Game Boy, there was the Game Boy Pocket and even the Lite. The same exact system with slight changes to the screen and the form factor. There was, of course, the GBA. It had the SP with the backlight. It had the GB micro, the things like that with different screens and form factors as well. But really, this is more like the Nintendo DS. Like the DS Lite hit, it was the same unit with aesthetic design changes and new screens. It happened again with the 3DS, with the 3DS XL, in which case, again, it was the same exact system, just with new, larger screens. And in some of these cases, many of these cases, updated, more powerful hardware did eventually arrive, but the first update is always like this, and the Switch is seemingly following that model to a T.
And I guess we've had the bonus of the light.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I actually forgot about the light in there, which so yeah, I guess that's kind of the weird thing then, is that the light follows that model, and then you get to this. So you see why this is so disappointing for us then, right?
There's no real technological advancement beyond the fact we, in theory, are going to get a much more impressive screen. And beyond that,
if this was a pure handheld, I think that would be more than adequate, but there's a lot of users that only use the Switch in docked mode, right?
Yeah.
And fundamentally, these users really won't see any boost as far as we know. Like, this is just going to be exactly the same. So it's kind of a weird situation to have both of these units now. I mean, it makes me think that maybe there's like a supply issue where it's like parts for the original Switch are now becoming increasingly scarce, so they've decided to source new LCDs and new display controllers and things like that to sort of like beef up the original model, but also making it easier to produce. But this doesn't feel like the kind of like new exciting product that everybody had been hoping for, basically.
No. But what I am going to do is give a shout out to Mike Heskin of the Switch Atmosphere team. They basically have reverse engineered the firmware, and basically they've been noting the references to a new model with a product name of Aula, A-U-L-A. And basically since April 2020 this machine has been in the firmware, and here's what he's got to say about it. In fact, this is what he said about it on January the 9th. Improved display of some sort with a new display controller. He said it's suggestive of an OLED or mini LED technology, which, is now been confirmed. He says the SoC is still the Marico Tegra X1. It looks like the DRAM is now on a 10 nanometer process, but it is still 4 gigabytes of memory. And he did speculate that there would be upscaling to 4K, which hasn't happened.
Yeah.
But he didn't really have any sort of details on what was actually happening with the display controller. I think one thing we should point out, though, we are getting 64 gigs of internal memory now, above 32.
That's nice.
Which is a pretty impressive spec point, relatively speaking. I mean, by mobile phone standards, it's pretty poor still. But by Switch standards, it's pretty impressive.
Honestly, though, like, the thing that really gets me here is that the more we talk, the more it's like they could have done a lot with the existing hardware and they've opted not to. For instance, the output, no 4K support, right?
Yep.
I'm positive that this system, it has the capabilities to do some sort of we know it can do 4K output because NVIDIA has done it before with a different product.
Using the same chip.
You can improve the output of the video without actually rendering at higher resolutions. For instance, I would have loved to see like a proper like nearest scale option or something to 4K, just allow it to give you this super crisp, clean, perfect scale up to 4K, which just using that alone would improve the end result on modern 4K screens. Basically, they had the opportunity to do anything here to make the Switch look better on the types of screens that are in living rooms today, and they've just opted not to do it at all, and that's really disappointing because, I mean, you've seen as well as I have, like, I think the Switch holds up really well in portable mode, and you've seen it as well. I think you can agree.
Absolutely.
But when you're playing these games on like a large 65 or larger 4K screen, they can look pretty grimy at times.
Yeah, I don't use... In fact, I don't think I've ever used the Switch as a living room console beyond the testing required for Digital Foundry. It's just not the product for me in that respect. It just doesn't look that good. But, a lot of people are quite happy with it,
Yeah, I know. It's just, I'm thinking about this even more, like, going back to older machines. So one of the things about Switch is that this is part of a generation where we have TAA and all these modern techniques, right, that are designed to improve image quality.
Yeah.
But those things only tend to really improve image quality when the actual output resolution the internal resolution is higher.
Yeah.
The problem with Switch games is that a lot of these run at such low resolutions that when you apply these things like TAA techniques and upsampling and all that, you end up with this extremely muddy image that looks really not great. Versus like using like the RetroTink 5X Pro, you hook up a GameCube to that, you put Metroid Prime on that at 480p, and with the correct settings, it looks crisp and attractive despite the fact that the resolution is 480p. Which is actually a resolution not far off from some Switch games, by the way.
But let's remember that some Switch titles are rendering under 480p in a dynamic manner. So
Yeah. Well, in terms of overall pixels, it's probably comparable since it's widescreen versus 4:3, right?
yeah, I get what you're saying. It's a missed opportunity.
It's how the pixels are treated that matters, right? It's not the total number of pixels, but what you do with those pixels and what's being done with the pixels right now. It's not great in the living room, and this is fundamentally the issue. Games have become more demanding. The next gen's out. As the Switch has continued on, we've seen image quality continue to degrade. We've seen Nintendo release first-party titles like the Zelda Age of Calamity, the Hyrule Warriors. That's what it was.
Sorry, it's called Age of Calamity.
Yeah, I think it is.
That's quite appropriate.
The performance is dreadful. We didn't get a chance to cover it because of next gen last year, but the frame rate is horrific. So when Nintendo itself is publishing titles like this, running at frame rates this low, and the image quality is just sinking, I don't know. Like, I like what the Switch is doing. I think it's amazing for a portable, but it's becoming clear that it's just not quite well suited to living room standards these days.
Yeah, I mean, I've always had doubts that there would be a Switch Pro this year simply because of the issues with semiconductor supply.
Yes.
And also, just in terms of peak sales, I don't think we've quite hit the point where sales are actually declining yet for the Switch. So from a business perspective, I don't think it makes sense for Nintendo to actually replace the base model. I think for the reasons you state, there is very definitely a huge argument to produce an improved Switch. Absolutely. But I just think it is going to be the actual Switch 2, I think we should probably call it at this point, just to avoid any confusion with this model. And at that point, well, I think the evidence surrounding the whole DLSS thing is looking very compelling. We've seen with Alex's recent video the enhancements with the latest renditions of DLSS.
That's right.
With the ultra performance mode where you can take a 720p image and it looks pretty reasonable at 4K. There's actually a whole lot going on that will make sense for a proper second generation Switch that will be able to still run, nicely at 720p as a handheld, but actual living room play should hold up on a modern display, I'd say.
Exactly.
But, it's not the product for this year, but I can't wait to see it. And in the meantime, I really like the Switch as a portable, and the notion that I'll be able to have it with an OLED screen, hugely compelling to me. But yes, I do wish that there were performance enhancements. I think simply by offering the chance to boost CPU frequency, that would actually probably prove just as meaningful, if not more so, than actually boosting the GPU.
It's not unheard of, though, too. We've seen this in, I think with the PSP shipped with some games like that.
Yeah.
I can't remember if the Vita did or not, but I know PSP for sure. Beyond homebrew, Sony allowed developers to sort of push the clocks up on select games.
Yeah, maybe we'll see that, but fundamentally, I still think that this is just going to ship as another Switch in the family. The potential for additional performance is there, but I just can't see it happening. But you know how these things go. I would love to be proven wrong.
Yeah, I agree. And, I've expressed plenty of disappointment here, but honestly, still, it is a nice looking upgrade. And as a sucker that actually does tend to get all these revisions, possibly foolishly, I am at least excited about having a Switch with a significantly better screen.
Absolutely.
Because the Vita had a great OLED screen. That went away in the second revision.
Right.
And that OLED screen was like 2012 OLED technology. So it's flawed compared to what we have today. So I expect this screen to be quite something. And I really think it's going to dramatically improve just the way games look in general, whether it's, a high-end 3D experience or like 2D pixel art. It's going to look great. It should also improve things like response time, so you get reduced blur and such. So the only potential downside of the screen is that it's larger, but the resolutions aren't going up. So, some of those deficiencies may become slightly more noticeable, but that's how it was with the XL versions of the DS, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, overall, I'm still interested in it, but it's, we just have to put aside that this isn't what we had hoped for, is not what Nintendo is building now, and just you kind of got to accept that, I guess.
Yeah, and I'm sure there'll be new information emerging at some point, and we'll be covering that in DF Direct. But for the time being, thanks for joining me on this one, John.
Sure thing.
And yeah, let's wrap this up. So as usual, like, subscribe, share, ring the bell for instant notifications, DF supporter program. Join us, support the team. Get amazing behind the scenes access, bonus videos, pristine quality video downloads. But that's all from John and I for now. Thanks for watching.